A 5-year-old mute boy found something moving under the mud in a quiet Los Angeles park. A pregnant dog, half buried and barely breathing. What happened next made the whole city stop and listen. And hey, if you could live anywhere in the world with your loyal dog by your side, where would it be? Tell us in the comments. Maybe our next story will happen right there. Los Angeles doesn't go quiet after rain. It hums. Tires slosh through puddles like distant waves. Traffic lights reflect in wet pavement like blurry constellations. But on the east side of the city, past the noise and down a broken sidewalk lined with chain-link fences, there's a sliver of forgotten parkland, a stretch of grass and mud that no one mows anymore, where no kids play, and only silence grows. That's where Ori wandered. He was 5 years old and had never spoken. Not once. Not a cry when he was born, not a word since. Doctors had names for it. Selective mutism, developmental delay, auditory trauma, but none of them had the truth. Ori simply lived in a world without voice, but not without understanding. He saw everything. Noticed things most people missed. A pigeon's wing bent wrong. Cracks in glass shaped like lightning. The way mud changed color just before it swallowed your boot. Ori was small, with round shoulders and wide, deep-set eyes that held the stillness of a lake. His hair was thick and dark, and his face looked older than 5, not in wrinkles, but in watching. He moved like someone who knew the world could break without warning. That morning the clouds had cleared, but the earth hadn't dried. Ori's boots squelched through the edge of the park as he followed a crow's shadow. The birds circled once overhead, then vanished beyond the trees. That's when he felt it. A tremble in the ground. Not a noise, a breath. Ori stopped. He knelt, pressing both hands into the mud, eyes scanning. Something was down there, breathing, weakly, dying. He began to dig. His small fingers clawed through the wet soil, slow at first, then frantic. The earth clung to him, cold and thick. His breath came in quiet gasps. First, he found fur, soaked, tangled, slick with filth. Then ribs, a leg, limp and stiff. And finally, an eye. A dog. Half buried in mud, she was large, too large for the shallow hole she'd been shoved into. Her coat was meant to be tan and black, but now it was the color of sludge. Her sides rose and fell in shudders. One eye was sealed shut with dried blood. The other blinked at Ori, slow and wet with pain. She was still alive. Her belly was huge, unnaturally round and tight, swollen in a way Ori didn't understand, but somehow knew wasn't normal. She had been down there for a long time, 2 days at least. The layers of rain-dried mud, the way her body had settled, everything told the same story. Someone had buried her, alive. She didn't growl, didn't move. There was no strength left for that. Ori stared. His chest ached in a way he didn't have words for. His breath fogged in the cold air. The scarf around his neck, striped red and blue, was suddenly in his hand. He reached out, wrapped it gently around the dog's head. Not for warmth, for comfort, for protection. Like giving her a name he didn't know how to say. She twitched slightly. Her eye followed his hand. That was all. Ori stood up and turned. He ran. Kayla was scrubbing a pan when the front door crashed open. She wasn't the kind of woman who startled easily. 35, with a compact, athletic build and short-cropped blonde hair that curled at the ends when she forgot to comb it, Kayla had worked emergency rooms and trauma wards for over a decade. She knew blood and grief and fatigue like old roommates. But her son, the boy who never cried, never called for her, was suddenly in front of her, soaked in mud, eyes wide with something close to terror. "Ori?" she said, wiping her hands. "What on earth?" He didn't answer. Of course he didn't. Instead, he grabbed her wrist, hard. Kayla's heart jumped. Okay, sweetheart. I'm coming." He pulled her through the door, down the stairs, through the gate. She barely had time to grab her keys. Her sneakers slapped through puddles. Ori didn't look back. His grip didn't loosen. His little arm strained like it might tear off if she didn't keep up. They crossed 2 streets, slid through the gap in the fence, into the overgrown park. Kayla had no idea what to expect. She thought, maybe he found a hurt bird. Maybe he found something dead, a cat hit by a car, a homeless person sleeping. She was not prepared for what she saw. Ori stopped at the shallow pit, stepped aside. Kayla looked down. The breath caught in her chest. It was a dog, barely recognizable, coated in layers of drying mud, blood along her snout, body twisted sideways like it had tried to escape and failed. Her belly, enormous, tense, pregnant. The eyes, one closed, the other glassy and sunken, followed Kayla with silent plea. "Oh, my God!" Kayla dropped to her knees. Her jeans soaked instantly, but she didn't care. Her hands moved automatically, part nurse, part mother. She brushed dirt from the dog's face, felt under the jaw for a pulse. Still alive, still breathing, buried for days, and still alive. Kayla's throat clenched. Who would do this? Ori stood next to her, his little hands hanging at his sides, fingers still caked with dirt. His eyes didn't blink. Kayla reached for the scarf wrapped around the dog's head. Her son's scarf. She let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. This wasn't an accident. Someone had buried this dog alive, pregnant, left her to die, and her son, her silent, gentle boy, had found her, had dug her out, had wrapped her in the only thing he could give. Kayla's hands trembled, and for the first time in months, she cried. She didn't wipe her tears. She just reached back, pulled her phone from her jacket, and dialed the only vet she knew who might still take a call on a Sunday morning. "Ori," she whispered, voice shaking. "You did good, baby. You did so good." Kayla's fingers were numb against her phone screen, the cold rain soaking through her sleeves as she knelt beside the half-buried dog. Her calls to local emergency vet clinics had been met with the same response. Too full, too late. The storm had shut down half the city. There were flooded streets, snapped power lines, and too many animals in need. No one could come. She looked at the dog, barely breathing, belly swollen, her ribs trembling with effort. Mud crusted in layers around her flanks. Her eyes were glazed, but not gone. "Someone buried her," Kayla whispered, half to herself. "She's pregnant, and someone buried her alive." Beside her, Ori didn't move. His small face was pale under his damp hair. He'd stopped shaking a few minutes ago, but his silence had changed. It was no longer blank. It was locked, like a dam bracing for a flood. He stared at the dog with quiet desperation, as if he could keep her alive by willing her breath to stay steady. Kayla knew time was short. She needed help. Not tomorrow, not in an hour, now. And that's when a name broke through the fog of panic. Avon Calder. It had been over 2 years since she last heard his voice, back when Jesse was still alive, and Avon had stitched their German Shepherd partner, Rook, back together after a rooftop fall no city vet dared attempt. Jesse had said Avon worked in shadows and silence, a man who'd walked out of veterinary medicine but still carried the skill in his bones, a former Army vet turned trauma specialist, turned recluse, and most importantly, a man who owed Jesse his life. Kayla stood quickly, brushed mud from her jeans, and looked down at Ori. "We're taking her to someone. I don't care what it takes." Ori blinked but said nothing. With effort, they wrapped the dog, still limp and barely conscious, in Kayla's thick coat. Ori held the edge of the bundle as they hurried back to the car, slipping twice in the mud, but never letting go. Dr. Avon Calder lived behind a shuttered auto shop on the far edge of Boyle Heights, where the road still rippled from the last earthquake and vines crept over the old chain-link fences. Kayla pulled up just before sundown. The rain had stopped, but the air was sharp with cold. The building was barely lit, a faint amber glow behind stained glass windows. A weather-worn sign above the door read, "Calder's," half the letters missing. She knocked once, then twice, then again, louder. The door opened after a long pause. Avon Calder looked like a man pulled halfway from a long sleep. He was in his early 70s, lean and wiry, his gray beard trimmed but uneven, and his eyes, sea glass green, looked straight through her like glass. His shirt was an old flannel with sleeves rolled to the elbow, revealing arms marked with faded scars. A battered leather apron hung loosely from his neck, stained with oil and something darker. Kayla had only met him once before, briefly, but she'd never forgotten his face. It was the kind that held stories nobody ever told aloud. "Kayla," he said, his voice slow and husky. She didn't answer at first, just turned slightly so he could see the bundle in her arms, and the flicker of breath inside it. "I didn't know who else to call," she said. "She's pregnant, buried alive. My son found her. Avon stepped forward, his hand moving gently over the dog's forehead. He didn't ask how or why, just looked at the dog's eyes, pressed 2 fingers beneath her jawline, and nodded once. Bring her in. The inside of the shop was half mechanics bay, half forgotten clinic. Cabinets lined one wall, metal tables lined the other. Everything smelled like disinfectant, copper, and loneliness. Dust curled in the corners, but the tools were spotless, as if they'd been waiting all this time. Avon moved with precision, clearing the center exam table in seconds. Kayla laid the dog down gently. Ori stood at the foot of the table, hands clenched in his sleeves. She's in shock, Avon muttered. Could be septic. She's days past due or days away. Can't say without imaging. Breathing shallow and temps low. Kayla bit her lip. Can you save her? I don't know yet. He didn't offer false hope. Avon wasn't built that way. A pulse reader was clipped onto the dog's ear. A thermal wrap came out from under the table. Fluids were started. Avon's hands were steady, methodical. Everything he touched responded, except the dog. She lay still, her body sinking into the warmth, but not rising with it. Avon looked at Ori, who hadn't moved. He's quiet, Avon said softly. Kayla nodded. He doesn't speak. Won't or can't. We don't know, not since Jesse passed. Avon's hands paused. He looked at her. I owe Jesse a lot, he said, almost a whisper. He pulled me out of something dark. I told him once, if it was ever time to repay that debt, just send a sign. Kayla's throat tightened. This is the sign. He nodded and returned to work. Minutes passed. Ori crept closer. The dog, still unnamed, twitched her hind leg once, then went still again. Avon adjusted the IV and stepped back. Now we wait. Her body's either going to fight or fade. Kayla placed a hand on Ori's back. She needs you here. Ori didn't nod, didn't look up. He stepped forward, reached for the edge of the table, and gently placed his small fingers on the dog's paw. She didn't react, but he stayed. His lips moved, once, then twice, and suddenly a sound came out. A word. Stay! Kayla's heart stopped. She turned to him, eyes wide. Stay, Ori said again, barely louder than a breath, as if the word had lived inside him for years and only just found a way out. Avon looked up from the chart he was filling in. He didn't say anything, just met Kayla's gaze and nodded slowly, almost reverently. The dog's eye fluttered. She needs a name, Avon said softly. What do we call her? Kayla swallowed. Her voice was tight, uncertain. I don't know. I didn't think to. Then, as if the name had floated to her on instinct, she whispered, Ilya. Avon repeated it once. Ilya. Strong name. Ori looked up at her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes wet. Kayla knelt beside him, pressed her forehead to his temple. You did something amazing today, she whispered. Ori turned back to Ilya and pressed both palms on the edge of the table. The word stayed between them. And in the quiet hum of the clinic, beneath the flicker of an old fluorescent bulb, a silent boy had finally spoken. Before next chapter, where are you watching from today? Is it warm where you are, or cold, like Iron Vale? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to know. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the old heater and the slow rhythm of Ilya's breathing. She lay curled on the padded table, eyes half-lidded, limbs trembling from exhaustion, her swollen belly rising and falling in shallow, uneven waves. The overhead light buzzed faintly, casting long shadows across the faded cabinets and dust-covered surgical tools. It had been years since this room in Alvin Calder's forgotten clinic had seen anything close to birth. And yet now, it was about to witness 6. Avon stood beside the table, gloved and silent, the ultrasound probe in one hand, his fingers moving with the calm, clinical care of someone who had seen too many things to panic anymore. He was reading the monitor with narrowed eyes, adjusting the contact angle along Ilya's belly. The machine crackled slightly. Grainy shapes shifted and reformed on screen like shadows in snow. 6, he said at last. She's carrying 6 pups. Kayla leaned in beside him, arms crossed tight against her chest, her face drawn with worry. And? Avon didn't answer right away. He adjusted the probe, angled it lower, and stared for a long moment. One of them, slower movement, possibly distressed. Could be cord compression, oxygen loss. We'll have to watch. Kayla pressed her lips together, hard. Ori sat on the floor a few feet away, his back straight, his legs tucked under him like a folded paper crane. In his lap was his sketchbook, and in his hand, a short stub of crayon. His eyes weren't on the monitor, they were on Ilya. He studied the way her sides moved, the subtle twitch of her ear, the soft groan in her throat every few breaths. Then he drew. Kayla glanced down as the page took shape. Not animals, not puppies, just 6 glowing dots inside a large oval. The shapes weren't hard-lined. They shimmered slightly, like something seen underwater. One dot was smaller than the others, dimmer. Avon noticed too. He gets it, he said quietly. Kayla nodded. Ori didn't look up. He tore the page carefully, stood, and walked toward the table. Gently, he laid the drawing beside Ilya's head, within her line of sight. She didn't move, but her ear twitched again, as if she saw something behind her eyes. He stayed by her side, tiny fingers resting on the table's edge. Ilya's breathing shifted again, heavier now, irregular. Avon placed a towel beneath her hips and checked her vitals. "She's starting," he said. Kayla stepped back, breath caught. The first contraction rippled through Ilya's body like a breaking wave. Her legs jerked. A muffled whimper escaped her muzzle. Ori's hands twitched, but he didn't back away. He was still, like stone in the wind. Avon worked fast and silent. After 10 minutes, the first pup was delivered, small, slick, trembling. He rubbed it down with a towel, cleared its airway. It let out a faint squeak. Alive. Kayla exhaled, hands clasped tightly. The second came quickly, stronger than the first. The third followed not long after, smaller, but breathing. Ilya's strength was already fading. Her breaths were ragged. She trembled violently. Ori stepped closer, his brow furrowed with something unspoken. Then came the fourth. It slid out still. Avon worked quickly, massaging, rubbing, clearing the mouth, checking for response. Nothing. He kept working. Still nothing. Kayla felt her stomach drop. "Is it?" "Yes," Avon said quietly. "Stillborn." Ori stared, his hands curled. He didn't cry, but his chest rose unevenly, and something shifted in his eyes. Not confusion, but recognition. Like he was meeting something he hadn't known existed, but had always been there, just outside a language. Loss. He didn't know the word, but he knew what it was. The silence in the room became heavier. Even Ilya seemed to feel it. Her head dropped, her body limp. Another contraction barely moved her. "She's crashing," Avon muttered. Kayla stepped toward Ori, but he moved before she could. He reached out, pressed his small hand gently to Ilya's side. He leaned close to her face, so close his lips nearly touched her fur. And then softly, from deep inside his chest, a whisper came. "Breathe." Kayla's breath hitched. Her hands flew to her mouth. It was the second word Ori had spoken in his entire life. Ilya's head twitched, her body tensed. Another contraction came, stronger. The fifth pup arrived, alive, wiggling. Avon gave a sharp nod. "She's not done!" The sixth came slower. She pushed, but it didn't move at first. Avon shifted position, checked the alignment, supported her body. Ilya whimpered, a sound raw and broken. Ori placed both hands on her belly this time. He closed his eyes, and with the gentleness of someone who had never spoken a full sentence, he whispered, "Don't go yet." Kayla froze. 3 words, clear, complete, like a dam bursting, not with noise, but meaning. Ilya exhaled in one long breath. The sixth pup slipped free. It didn't move. Avon worked quickly again, urgency in his hands. Ori kept whispering, again and again, "Don't go yet!" And then, a twitch, a kick, a breath. Alive. All 6 had arrived. Only one would never open its eyes. Ori looked down at the still one. His fingers trembled. He didn't cry. He simply picked up his sketchbook, turned to a clean page, and drew a small heart with a soft halo around it. He set the page beside the puppy and stepped away. Avon stood back, his hands red with effort, his eyes tired but still sharp. Kayla moved to Ori and knelt, wrapping her arms around him from behind. "You knew," she whispered. "You felt it." Ori nodded once. No tears. Just silence again. But a silence now full of memory. The room smelled like warmth and new life. 6 small hearts beat where none had been before. And Ori, the boy who had never spoken, now understood something even adults rarely could. That even when a life ends before it begins, it matters. The sun was barely rising when Avon Calder noticed the glint. He had just finished checking the pups. 5 tiny hearts wrapped in blankets and nestled against Ilya's belly. One empty towel folded beside them in quiet memory. Kayla was resting in the corner chair, head back, arms crossed, half asleep, but ready to leap up at the slightest change. Ori sat on the floor as always, his sketchbook in his lap, now filled with quiet tributes. A star for the stillborn, a trail of paw prints for the others. It was Ilya's neck that caught Avon's eye. Beneath the thick mat of dried blood, fur, and stubborn mud, something metallic was wedged against her skin. A small curve of steel, torn and twisted, half swallowed by her coat. "Let me see you, girl," Avon whispered. He moved gently, parting her fur, gloved hands working slowly. Kayla stirred, blinking toward him. "What is it?" Avon didn't answer right away. He extracted the object and wiped it clean on a towel. It was a broken military K9 tag, the kind issued only through official channels, long and narrow, made of brushed steel. The engraving was worn but legible. USMC K9, hash 45796L. Kayla stood beside him. "That's a Marine Corps dog?" Avon nodded slowly. "Yeah, and this number? I think I know someone who can trace it." The name that came to Avon's mind was Elliot Brann, a former Marine Corps provost marshal and longtime K9 handler, now retired and working as a consultant for the city's animal control unit. Avon hadn't spoken to Elliot in over 6 years, not since the two had parted ways during a bitter disagreement about euthanasia policies on failed military dogs. Elliot had grown bureaucratic, cold, but he still owed Avon one favor. He made the call anyway. Elliot answered on the second ring. His voice was gruff, tinged with smoke, like someone who drank coffee too strong and never forgave easily. "Avon, thought you fell off the grid." "I did. Now I'm crawling back for one thing. I've got a broken USMC tag. Female German Shepherd. Scarred. Pregnant. Buried alive and survived it. I want to know where she came from." There was a long pause. "You have the number?" Elliot asked. Avon read it slowly. "I'll run it. Give me a couple hours." The call ended without goodbye. Back at the clinic, Ori was hovering near the edge of Ilya's bedding. Every time the front door creaked, he looked up, wide-eyed, heart already braced. Ilya, though still weak, flinched visibly when a siren passed by in the distance. Her breathing quickened when she heard boots on pavement, even if they were Maribel's, not a uniformed stranger. Kayla noticed it first. "She reacts to authority sounds," she whispered. "Badly." Ori nodded. He placed a hand on Ilya's flank, calming her without speaking. Kayla watched the way the dog leaned into him, even in fear. "She's terrified of uniforms, but not of him." Avon re-entered the room, towel over his shoulder, brow tense. "She's not just any K9. She was trained. She followed combat signals. That flinch isn't fear, it's memory." "Of what?" He didn't answer. Not yet. The answer came later that afternoon. Elliot called back. Ilya, if that's her name, was in the system under designation Indigo Echo, assigned to Sergeant Mason Rourke, 4th Logistics Battalion. 4 deployments overseas. Came home 2 years ago. Something went bad during a training operation. 1 Marine was killed, a corporal. They claimed the dog disobeyed a command. Kayla stood frozen. "They dishonorably retired her?" Avon asked. "No, they kept her under Rourke's private care. Said he'd take responsibility. Records show she was handed over and signed off as a companion animal. And now she's buried in a park." "Yeah." Avon's jaw clenched. "You know where he lives?" Elliot hesitated. "You don't want to go there?" Elliot, a sigh. "He's still in Los Angeles, Boyle Heights, off Crescent and 9th. Last known address registered 2 months ago." Kayla leaned against the counter, hands trembling. "Someone tried to erase her." Avon looked at Ori, who was now kneeling beside Ilya again, his eyes searching hers. "Someone wanted her dead." Maribel, who had returned to check on the pups, entered quietly. She was wiping down the counter when she asked, "What kind of man buries a pregnant dog alive?" "Someone who needed her silence," Avon answered. Later, Kayla stepped outside to breathe. The city around her moved on. Traffic pushing, sirens humming, a child on a scooter laughing far off. None of them knew that one dog had survived something unspeakable, and one boy had begun to speak because of her. She looked out across the street. Cracked sidewalks, flickering lights, rusted mailboxes. It wasn't a postcard city, but it had given her this. She whispered into the breeze, "Is this the kind of city that breaks you, or the kind that rebuilds you?" And in that question, maybe another one lingered. For those who'd lived in cities that had changed them forever. Have you ever lived in a city that almost erased you, but didn't? That night, Ilya stirred in her sleep, paws twitching. Ori stayed close, one hand always near her heartbeat. She no longer trembled at the sound of passing cars. But when the headlights flashed across the front window, a wide SUV, black, silent, idling for just a moment too long, her ears shot up, her breath caught. Ori noticed. His head turned sharply to the window. The SUV rolled away a second later. No license plate, no sound. But in Ori's sketchbook, there appeared a new page that night, a shape he'd never drawn before. A large black vehicle, and in the window, a pair of red eyes that weren't quite human. There was a wind that whistled through the old gutters of Calder's clinic. Not sharp, not cold, just enough to stir the leaves along the cracked pavement, enough to whisper through the window frames at night. Ori had taken to sitting by those windows, legs tucked under him, sketchbook in his lap, watching shadows slip by. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting. Ilya slept beside him on a bed made of towels and faded quilts. Her belly had gone soft again, her breathing slow but steady. The pups nestled against her chest like living buttons, warm, needy, and always squeaking for more. Ori watched over all of them like a little shepherd without a crook, whispering words he never used for anyone else. He spoke to Ilya in the voice he had never given the world, low, broken, full of shape but no shame. "Once there was a knight," he told her one night, brushing a hand through her fur, "who rode a motorcycle instead of a horse." Kayla was in the next room, leaning against the doorway, arms folded over her chest. She didn't move. She didn't interrupt. She just listened, heart breaking a little more with each sentence Ori offered, like a secret unwrapped too slowly. Ori's stories weren't made up. Not really. They were memories filtered through a child's dream. A man in uniform with a badge instead of a sword, a leather jacket instead of armor, a radio instead of a horn. And he always arrived at the last minute, always knew what to do, always saved someone. It was Jesse. Though Ori never used the name, he called him the Knight in the Wind. He had fire on his shoulders, Ori whispered, and his bike made the bad things go quiet. Kayla closed her eyes. For so long, she had prepared herself for the idea that Ori would never speak. Therapists had taught her the word acceptance, but nothing in her mother's heart had accepted that silence. Yet now, as he poured his soul into this battered dog and her 5 new lives, Kayla understood something clearer than any diagnosis. Ori hadn't been mute. He'd just been waiting for someone who truly needed to hear him. It was Maribel who noticed the fever. She had come in for her usual checkup on the pups, her braids pinned under a colorful scarf and a lemon cough drop in the corner of her mouth, which she rolled between her teeth when she was thinking. She leaned over Ilya, hand on her flank, eyes narrowing. "She's burning up." Kayla came at once. "She was fine this morning." Maribel shook her head. "Something's changed. Could be postpartum infection, or internal bleeding we didn't catch." Avon arrived a moment later, rubbing sleep from his eyes, still in the same shirt from the day before. He took one look and went stiff. "Prep fluids, antibiotics. We'll need to stabilize before we can do anything else." Kayla turned to Ori, who had gone pale. His eyes were locked on Ilya's face, his hands trembling just above her fur. The pups were pulled from her side and placed gently in a heated nest beside the table. Ori followed, sitting beside Ilya again, this time closer. Closer still, until his cheek touched her shoulder. Avon worked. Maribel helped. Kayla paced. The heater hummed louder now, as if trying to drown out what everyone was afraid to say. And then the seizures began. It started with a tremor in Ilya's paw. Then her whole body jerked violently, a helpless arc of muscle and pain. Her eyes rolled, her breath caught. Ori didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just held her tighter. Avon moved fast. Injections, restraints, soft padding against her sides. But her temperature continued to rise, and her breath came in sharp, stuttering gasps. "She's not responding," Avon said. "We need to bring her temperature down now, or we lose her." Maribel ran for ice packs. Kayla held her breath. Ori spoke again. Softly, repeatedly, the way only a child who had loved once and lost once could speak. "Don't leave me too," again and again. "Don't leave me too." He pressed his face into her shoulder, whispering it like prayer, like protest. Kayla fell to her knees beside him, reaching out, wrapping both of them in her arms. "I'm here," she said. "We're here." But Ori didn't move. He kept saying it, as if those words could trade places with whatever sickness was taking Ilya away. "Don't leave me too." The fever broke just before dawn. It was Maribel who noticed the shift. "She's sweating now, heart rate's down." Avon checked again, his hand over her chest. "We're not out of the woods, but she's not slipping anymore." Ori hadn't stopped whispering for 4 straight hours, but now, as Ilya's breath evened out, he finally rested his head beside hers. His hand never left her side, and he slept. Later that morning, when the sky turned gold behind the windows and the pups stirred in their basket, Avon stepped outside for air. The street was still empty, save for a lone jogger with earbuds in a city bus that squeaked to a stop, door sighing open like a yawn. The city was waking up again, it always did. But Avon stared at the horizon, where the skyline flickered in sunlight and haze, and wondered, what kind of city did this story belong to? One that buried things, or one that helped them rise again? And for those watching from afar, he asked silently, have you ever lived in a city where your silence finally cracked, and something wild and alive came out? Inside, Kayla watched Ori sleep beside Ilya, his fingers still curled in her fur, his lips slightly parted, no longer sealed in silence. She touched a photograph she kept in her wallet. Jesse on his motorbike, grinning. Wind in his hair, fire in his eyes. Ori had never stopped missing him. Not in words, but in everything else. And now, in the voice he had only just begun to find. The rain had stopped 3 days ago, but the air still carried the weight of it. A hush that clung to the walls, as if Los Angeles itself were holding its breath. Ilya's fever had returned overnight. It began with shallow breathing. Then came the trembling, the rapid heartbeat, the sunken eyes. The pups whimpered when she didn't respond. Kayla had bundled them close, whispering reassurances she didn't believe, while Avon ran his hands over the dog's flank with grim precision. "Postpartum sepsis," he said finally. "It's spreading faster than we hoped. If we don't operate, she won't make it till morning." Kayla exhaled through her teeth. "Then we operate." Avon nodded, but something in his eyes flickered. Doubt. Not in his skill, but in Ilya's strength. Ori stood at the door, barefoot in pajamas, hair a mess, eyes wide and already brimming. He had said nothing since the fever returned. Kayla walked over and knelt. "Sweetheart, Ilya's very sick. Avon needs to take her into surgery, and it's going to be scary. I think maybe you should stay home this time, with me." "No." His voice came fast, clear, final. Kayla blinked. Ori's lips trembled, but he held her gaze with a quiet that didn't ask permission. "I'm going with Ilya." A complete sentence, his first. Kayla pressed a hand to her heart. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, baby." They prepped the table quickly. Avon moved like a man walking a tightrope. His face remained calm, but his hands worked with tense precision. Every syringe, every clamp, every cloth, in its place. Maribel arrived within the hour, hair tied back, earrings left at home, the sleeves of her sweater pushed past her elbows. She had brought her daughter with her, Tanya, a shy, observant girl of around 12, who kept mostly to herself and carried a book everywhere she went. She was tall for her age, with long, wiry limbs and a habit of not speaking until spoken to. Her presence was quiet but comforting. "She okay to stay?" Maribel asked Kayla. Kayla nodded. "Ori might need someone to sit with." Tanya settled beside Ori without a word. She didn't try to talk. She just opened her book, a story about wild horses, and held it between them. Ori didn't look at her, but after a moment, he scooted an inch closer. The operation began just after 9. Kayla helped Avon sedate Ilya, her hand resting on the dog's paw until the last blink closed her eyes. Ori stayed in the next room, standing at the glass divider, watching. Maribel stayed with him, Tanya by his side. The pups had been moved to a heated basket near the far wall, safe and oblivious. Inside the room, the air grew still. Kayla readied the clamps. Avon made the first incision. For 30 minutes, nothing went wrong. The infection had taken root near the uterus. A fast, aggressive spread, but containable. Avon worked in silence. Kayla wiped sweat from his forehead twice. Then Ilya's heart monitor gave a single long tone. Flatline. Ori's head snapped toward the sound. Kayla froze. Avon! He was already moving. Epinephrine, now, charging paddles. Kayla moved faster than thought, prepping the defibrillator. Maribel pushed into the room, grabbing the oxygen bag. Clear. The first shock jolted through Ilya's body. No rhythm. Again, clear. The second hit. Silence. Ori began to tremble. Tanya put her hand on his wrist. Avon's voice lowered. One more. He placed the paddles. Ori pressed both palms to the glass. Baba! The word came out broken, like a breath caught between sleep and scream. Kayla heard it and nearly dropped the clamps. Baba! Ori repeated. Save her like you did the kids. Avon didn't hear him, but Ilya must have, because after the third shock, her heart thudded back into rhythm. Not fast, not strong, but real. She breathed. Kayla gasped. We've got pulse. Ori collapsed to his knees, his hands pressed to the floor, sobbing. It was the first time Kayla had ever heard him cry aloud. Not a scream, not a tantrum, just pure, soul-deep sorrow. She dropped beside him, arms wrapping tight around his small body, whispering through her own tears. You did it, baby. You called him. You brought her back. Later that night, with Ilya sleeping under warm blankets, her pups pressed against her side, Ori climbed up into the chair beside her. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Tanya gave him her book to hold. He didn't read it, just turned the pages softly, one after the other, while Ilya's chest rose and fell with steadier rhythm. Kayla stood with Avon in the hall, both of them watching the scene through the glass. He said Baba, she whispered. Avon nodded. He meant Jesse? She nodded too. He always called him that before he stopped speaking. Avon's face was unreadable. Sometimes the dead don't stay in dreams. Sometimes they hold the thread from the other side. She looked at him. You believe that? I didn't, until tonight. Outside, the city exhaled. A gust of wind stirred the leaves, lifting one loose flyer taped to the power pole. A missing pet notice, long since faded, drifting into the gutter like a prayer never answered. A bus rumbled past. A couple argued 2 streets away. Life continued in Los Angeles, unaware that a boy had called to the wind and it had listened. Sometimes, a city doesn't just test you. It breaks you, rebuilds you, and leaves you standing in the middle, trying to name what's been made new. Have you ever lived in a city where someone you loved still echoed in the air? Ori had, and now so had Ilya. The city had returned to its usual hum. Horns, wind, distant sirens, the crackle of morning news on kitchen radios. But inside the faded brick building that housed Dr. Calder's forgotten clinic, time had not moved on. Not quite. Because Ori had seen the shadow again. The black SUV returned on a Monday morning just before sunrise. It didn't park. It didn't honk. It simply passed by slowly, the driver's side window cracked open, dark glass glinting. Then, it vanished down 9th Street, swallowed by the mist and alleys that lined the forgotten parts of the city. Ori didn't panic. He simply picked up his crayon and drew it again, the same vehicle, red eyes behind the windshield, a figure in the driver's seat made only of shadow. Avon saw the car too. From the upstairs window, he caught the plate this time, a partial, but enough. He made one call, to Elliot Brand. Got movement? Avon said. Same SUV, I want this done. I'm already on it, Elliot replied. His name's still Mason Rourke, dishonorably discharged, bad history. He lives not far from you. Still armed? Registered owner of 2 firearms. You need to be careful. I am, Avon muttered, but the dog wasn't. Kayla pressed charges within the day. She didn't just bring evidence. She brought Ori's sketchbook, the original metal tag, and the veterinary records. More than anything, she brought a boy who had never spoken, until a buried dog taught him to. Detective Marla Reyes was assigned the case. She was tall, olive-skinned, built like a blade, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore no jewelry and almost no expression. Her voice was calm, deliberate, and final. She sat across from Kayla and Ori in the precinct's small interview room, hands folded, eyes sharp. "This man buried a living pregnant dog," Kayla said. "My son found her. That's why he speaks now." Reyes glanced at Ori. "You found her?" Ori nodded slowly. He reached into his backpack and handed her the latest drawing. Ilya in the dirt, scarf around her head, one eye open. Reyes looked at it for a long time. "I'll get the warrant." It took 3 days. They brought Mason Rourke in at 6:43 a.m. He opened the door in a sweatshirt, one boot on, the other in his hand. He didn't resist, but he smiled. "Was just a dog," he muttered as they cuffed him. Reyes didn't flinch. "She wasn't yours to bury." The search of his home revealed more than anyone expected. The broken tracking collar, shovels still stained with old dirt. A training log, redacted, slashed through, names blacked out in marker. A file of photos. Ilya in uniform, on base. In one, she stood beside a younger Rourke. He was smiling. She was not. One corner of the garage held a twisted metal sign that read Indigo Echo, barely legible. When Reyes asked him why, Rourke only shrugged. "She failed. Got my teammate killed. They were going to take her from me. I figured I'd finish the job first." The statement went on record. At the arraignment, the courtroom was full. Animal rights groups, journalists, veterans, a few Marines who had once worked with K-9 units, men and women who remembered Ilya, who had read about her survival and wept. Ori didn't attend, but his sketchbook did. Kayla submitted it as evidence, each page labeled chronologically. The court saw Ilya's collapse, her rescue, her pups, her pain, the red-eyed SUV, and, at the center of it all, a child learning to speak through love. The judge, Ramona Ellis, was a silver-haired woman in her early 60s, with eyes like cold steel and a reputation for never blinking during sentencing. She read the charges aloud: felony animal cruelty, intentional harm to a service animal, obstruction of official transfer, attempted unlawful euthanasia. Rourke stood still, defiant. The judge didn't raise her voice. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "you were entrusted with a living, loyal being trained to protect. When she did not serve your pride, you punished her with silence. You buried her body because you could not bury your shame. And yet, she survived. Her pups survived. And the child who found her, a child who could not speak, now does." She paused. "You will serve 12 years in state prison. You will receive mandatory psychological evaluation. You are permanently banned from owning, handling, training, or residing with animals for life. Your name is now etched in record alongside your crime. May it never be forgotten." Rourke's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. The gavel struck. Justice had spoken. Ori didn't cheer. He didn't need to. He was lying on the floor beside Ilya and her 5 pups, brushing the fur on her shoulder with slow, careful strokes. He'd taken to calling them the Stars now, each with a nickname he whispered only to them. Kayla sat nearby, folding laundry that no longer felt like work. "You knew," she whispered, watching him. "You knew he'd be punished." Ori nodded. "She didn't run," he said softly, "so I didn't either." A week later, a letter arrived at the clinic. It was from a school for therapy dogs in Northern California. Amelia Tron, who had once knelt beside the pups and said, "She forgives." The letter said they had a place open. They wanted Ilya and her pups to raise and train as emotional support animals for children in trauma recovery. Kayla read the letter aloud. Ori listened, then looked at Ilya. She stared back at him. Then, without speaking, Ori got up and took his sketchbook. He opened to a fresh page and drew 5 stars orbiting a 6th one, dim but glowing. He wrote only 3 words below it. "She stays first," Kayla smiled. "Then she stays." Outside, the city kept moving. Los Angeles didn't slow for miracles, but sometimes it made space for them. Maybe you live in a place where the good are buried quietly, and the loud go unpunished. Or maybe, just maybe, you live in a city where the truth crawls back up from the dirt. Have you ever lived in a place like that? Ori had, and because of that, so had Ilya. The clinic smelled like cedar and baby shampoo that morning, the kind Maribel used when washing the pups every other day. Sunlight fell in streaks across the floor, illuminating dust motes that danced around Ilya's head as she dozed with her chin on her paws. Her body was strong again. The wound from surgery had healed, the fever hadn't returned, and her 5 pups, now 1 month old, tumbled around her legs like noisy wind-up toys with ears too big for their heads. Ori sat cross-legged on the floor, a spool of red thread in one hand, a needle in the other. His face was pinched in concentration as he carefully stitched words into the corner of his old scarf. The letters were uneven, but legible. "You taught me to speak." He held it up to the light, then folded it, quietly proud. Kayla watched from the doorway, arms crossed gently, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You want to give it to her now?" Ori nodded. He stood, tiptoed to Ilya, and knelt beside her. She raised her head, her ears perking slightly. Ori held the scarf like a medal. She sniffed it once, then licked his cheek. The gift was accepted. Over the next week, the clinic saw more visitors than it had in years. The first to arrive was Mrs. Lillian Cho, a widow in her 70s who wore gardening gloves even indoors. She had known Jesse from a community garden program he once helped fund for her late husband's PTSD group. She arrived with a cane and a gentle Labrador named Miso. "I heard," she said softly to Kayla, "that the pups were ready. I thought maybe Miso could use a friend." She adopted the chubbiest one, the pup with the single white sock and a bark louder than its body. The second family was younger, Nico and Jada Harper, a firefighter couple who had once been rescued by Jesse when their apartment complex caught fire. They chose the shyest pup, who trembled at loud sounds, but curled instantly into Jada's arms. Avon watched quietly from his workbench, polishing an old syringe case. "These aren't adoptions," he murmured to Kayla. "They're returns. Debts repaid in fur." Kayla wiped a tear and smiled. Jesse would have said the same. The last letter came 2 days before Ilya was scheduled to leave. It was from a center in Northern California, Sierra Pines Recovery Village, a forested campus for children with trauma-related mutism, autism, and anxiety. Amelia Tron, who had visited weeks earlier, had written, "We've never had a candidate like Ilya. Her presence speaks louder than most words. We believe she was born for this, and so were the children waiting for her." Kayla read it aloud while Ori sat beside Ilya, stroking her neck. He said nothing at first. Then he looked at Kayla and asked quietly, "Will they love her?" Kayla knelt beside him. "I think they'll listen to her, just like you did." Ori nodded slowly. "Then she can go." The morning of Ilya's departure arrived clear and bright, with wind pushing through the lemon trees outside the clinic like a whisper. Ori wore a clean shirt and mismatched socks. His backpack held his sketchbook, 3 crayons, and the scarf, now neatly folded. A small crate sat by the front door, lined with blankets and a calming scent spray. Ilya sat beside it, her body still but alert. The pups had already been sent to their new homes, except one. The smallest pup, with a spot over one eye and a tail that never stopped wagging, stood between Ori and the door. Kayla crouched and looked at her son. "They said one pup could stay," she whispered. "Only if you want to." Ori looked down at the puppy, who was now chewing the hem of his pant leg. He smiled. "I think I'll call her Echo." Avon raised an eyebrow. "Why Echo?" Ori shrugged. "Because she answers me, even when I don't speak." They all stood quietly for a moment. Then Kayla opened the crate. Ilya walked inside without hesitation. But before Kayla could shut the door, Ori leaned in, pressing the scarf into Ilya's side. "You already know," he whispered, "but just in case you forget." She licked his cheek one last time. Then the door clicked. The van arrived at 10 sharp. Amelia Tran stepped out, dressed in a forest green hoodie, with a paw print pin over the heart. Her eyes lit up the moment she saw Ilya. "She looks even stronger now," she said. "Are you ready, girl?" Ilya barked once, soft, calm. Ori stood behind Kayla, Echo cradled in his arms. His eyes were wet, but his chin was high. "She knows what to do," he said. Amelia knelt beside him. "Do you?" Ori thought for a moment. Then he nodded. "She found her new stars. I'll take care of mine." She smiled, gently took the crate, and loaded it into the van. As the door shut, Ori raised his hand, not in goodbye, but in salute. Ilya watched him through the mesh for a long second, and then she was gone. That night, Ori sat by the window, Echo curled in his lap, her head rising and falling with each breath. The stars above Los Angeles blinked through the haze, a few faint ones glimmering just above the horizon. Kayla brought him cocoa and sat beside him. "Do you miss her already?" Ori nodded. "But you're okay?" He looked out the window. "She's listening somewhere." Kayla tilted her head. "Even when you're quiet?" "Especially then." In the corner of the room, Avon was reading the newspaper. A small article tucked in the margin noted a subtle but beautiful trend. Record number of therapy dogs placed with children this year, many of them former rescues. No names mentioned, just results. Avon folded the paper, looked at Kayla and Ori, then smiled. "Funny thing about healing," he said. "Sometimes it flies out the door and still circles back." Some nights, when Echo dreams, she lets out small howls, barely audible, and Ori, in the half-sleep between boy and memory, reaches over and touches her head. "You're home," he whispers. "You're safe." Because some hearts don't need words. They just need a soul willing to listen. And sometimes, the flight beyond the rainbow isn't goodbye. It's a circle, one you didn't know you were part of until it brought you back. Have you ever lived in a city where a goodbye turned into a beginning? Ori had. And this time, he wasn't afraid to say the words. Sometimes, God doesn't speak through thunder or angels. Sometimes, he whispers through the smallest breath, through the paw of a broken dog, or through the voice of a child who was never supposed to speak. Ori didn't learn to talk through therapy or science. He spoke because he loved, because something pure and voiceless reached into his silence and waited there with him. That's the miracle. Maybe the greatest gift from heaven isn't healing that comes instantly, but healing that walks toward us, on four legs, muddy, broken, and still wagging its tail. In a world full of noise, Ilya never used a single word. But she taught a child to speak. That, my friend, is proof that love, even in silence, is holy. So, if you're holding on to hope today, if you're waiting on a sign, maybe it won't come in the way you expect. Maybe it'll come wrapped in fur, in patience, in something God sends not to change your mind, but to open your heart. May the Lord bless you, dear viewer, with eyes that see the quiet ones, with hands that heal gently, and with a heart that always has room for one more miracle. If this story touched your heart, please let us know in the comments. Have you ever witnessed a moment that felt like a miracle? We read every story, every memory. Share this video with someone who needs hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true, heartwarming stories, where love walks on four legs and God sometimes answers without a single word. And until next time, may your home be warm, your pets be safe, and your heart be open.